Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webcast. We've called today's webcast The True Cause for the Start of World War III. What we want to talk about is what is actually behind the shadow war, which people keep referring to as the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Who's actually with war with whom? We would argue that the financially desperate city of London and Wall Street have declared war not only against Russia and China and soon India, but actually also against the populations of Europe, South and Central America, Africa, and even the United States itself. The idea here is that there is going to be a total destruction of Russia's and China's, as well as any other nation's, science-driven economic development. That is to say, the pathway that these nations have chosen, that is often referred to as the Belt and Road Initiative. And the idea is that that Belt and Road Initiative and economic development through it is considered to be a casus belli, a cause of war by the City of London. When people talk about the thing called the Great Reset, what they mistakenly see as some sort of environmentalist measure or green measure, what you're really talking about is what former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, talked about during the summer of 2019 as financial regime change. The finance minister of France this week, Bruno Le Maire, made some statements that he then had to retract. But in his original statements, which were made as an interview, he said the sanctions imposed on Russia are even frighteningly effective. And I do not want to leave any ambiguity about the European determination on this issue. We are going to wage an all-out financial and economic war against Russia. The question was put to him, against Russia or against Vladimir Putin? And then he said, against Russia, against Vladimir Putin, against his government. But the Russian people will also pay the consequences. Let's be clear. We want to target the heart of the Russian system. We target Vladimir Putin, we target the oligarchs, but we also target the entire Russian economy. He had used in a formulation in a slightly earlier interview, the financial nuclear weapon. This was responded to by former head of government of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, when he said in a tweet, today a French minister said he had declared economic war on Russia. Watch out for your language, gentlemen, and don't forget that economic wars in the history of humanity often were transformed into real wars. Further, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Wednesday of this week that if a third world war were to take place, it would involve nuclear weapons and be very destructive. He also said that Russia was very concerned about having to launch a military operation into Ukraine because they would face a real danger if Kiev acquired nuclear weapons. Many have been talking about this fire at the nuclear plant and stories that have circulated. Well, today what we're going to do is we've brought together a panel to discuss with you the actual circumstances that are evolving as we speak on the ground, both in Ukraine and in terms of the Russia-NATO confrontation, which is much more at the center of all of this. And so we're going to get right to it. And we've got a panel today which consists of Harley Schlanger, spokesman for the LaRouche organization, Mike Robinson of UK Column, Carl Osgood, who is a military analyst for Executive Intelligence Review magazine, and Diane Sayre, who is with the ICLC International Executive Committee. So we're going to start right in with Harley, who will get us started and then continue. So Harley?
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Look, I think what will be made clear by the time we get through with this discussion today is that what we've been saying all along about the nature of this so-called Ukraine crisis is that it actually is the eclipsing of an untenable policy called the unipolar order or the rules-based order. The real battle is becoming increasingly clear. It's between those nations that stand for the principles of economic development of sovereign nation states through collaboration versus those who bow down to the power, the military might of the unipolar order, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, and NATO. And I put the United Kingdom separate, even though it's part of NATO, and the U.S. is part of NATO also. But the U.S. and the British are the two countries driving this. And the NATO and Europe is, in a sense, a hostage. Just as the people of Ukraine are a hostage. They're cannon fodder in this. The discussion of how this is about the destruction of Ukraine, well, what is destroying Ukraine is the insistence of the unipolar order, that there'll be no change on the power of the order coming from London and Wall Street. And I'll go through an element of this, and I'm sure you'll get more as we go through the evening or the afternoon. But an example of this is a statement from Sergei Lavrov in a press conference given yesterday. And he said, the world order is at stake. And what he means by that is very clear. The effort of the major powers of the West to impose on the world a great reset, a central banker's dictatorship that will be for benefit for supranational corporate cartels, but not for any sovereign nation, and that any sovereign nation that steps out of line becomes a target. And that's become increasingly clear. One example of this is what just happened with the meeting of the Quad over the last couple of days. The Quad is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. And the idea is that this would become, in a sense, an Asian NATO. Now, at this meeting, they tried to get through a resolution condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. And Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, refused to go along with it. He said India would not condemn Russia and instead called for dialogue and diplomacy. Now, what has come out since then is that there was actually a cable from the State Department on how to deal with India and the United Arab Emirates, both of which were unwilling to condemn Russia. And the language in the cable is as follows. Continuing to call for dialogue is not a stance of neutrality. It places you in Russia's camp. Now, this sounds a lot like what George W. Bush said after 9/11, where he said, you're either with us or with the terrorists. And that, in fact, is the way Washington and London and NATO are looking at it and are trying to shape it. Now, we saw a UN General Assembly vote the other day, and there were 45 nations which either abstained or were not present for the vote. The majority of nations voted with the US and the British and NATO. But the fact that 1/4 of the nations in the world did not go along with it, and by the way, the population of those nations are probably close to half the world's population. 27 out of the 55 countries in Africa refused to go along with this. So we're seeing a growing split. And the issue that we have defined from the beginning, the underlying issue, has nothing to do with Ukraine. Ukraine was used as a pretext to escalate a war against Russia. This is not something new. This is, in fact, what Putin had been raising from the beginning, that the deployment of offensive weapons in Ukraine, the attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO, was targeting Russia's national security. And this is the central issue for Russia. And in fact, it's clear Putin reiterated again that what is it that Russia wants? A neutral Ukraine, nuclear-free, demilitarized, denazified, and the recognition that Crimea is part of the Russian Federation and that the independent People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk are recognized as sovereign nations. There would not have been fighting in Ukraine had the West negotiated honestly with Putin from the beginning, but they didn't. Now, the effect of this is not only economic warfare against Russia, this is economic warfare against the people of Europe. The gas and oil prices are skyrocketing. and that affects everyone in Europe. It also, by the way, affects everyone around the world. It affects the poorer countries of Africa. It affects everyone in the United States, as you've seen the skyrocketing prices of gas at the pump, the utility costs are going up. And these are not only related to the combat going on in Ukraine, but the speculative system and the hyperinflationary policy of bailing out the corporate cartels that are essentially bankrupt. So again, at the heart of this is this issue of the bankruptcy of a financial system that has increasingly tightened its grip on the world since 1971 and is based on a speculative commitment to defend the debt and debt collection, and to in fact increase the debt to pay the old debt, as opposed to invest in physical economy. And what the Schiller Institute has taken as its lead is the call for a convention to address this question of a security order which recognizes the national security interests of every nation and all peoples. And directly connected with that is a transformation of the global financial system, not to a great reset, but to a cooperative approach based on investment for all nations in the physical economy, in platforms of infrastructure, and especially in education and culture for the children, and a scientific culture for the future. Now, I want to take up one issue here in particular, because I've been watching this, how this is being used to try to portray Putin as some kind of deranged lunatic. That is his call for the denazification of Ukraine. Now, if you are only familiar with the story coming from the Western media, you're being told that Putin is paranoid, Putin is making it up, the issue of Nazis is a non-issue. Well, the reality is very different. And this is where you can see the role of lies and censorship, along with the economic sanctions and economic warfare policy, as the force being used by the unipolar power to try to keep the world in line, to sustain an existing order which is broken down. Let me just give you an example, and it's worth listening to this and thinking about it, because you're not getting this in the Western media. I will say one example is a couple of articles on Consortium News in the last couple of days by Ben Norton and Alex Rubinstein and Max Blumenthal, but it's not in the mainstream media. It's not on CNN. They're still saying Putin is a nut for bringing up the Nazi question. Well, there was an interview done with a leader of a group called C14 named Yevhen Karas. And this was an interview done with him in early February by Alex Rubinstein. And here's what he had to say. He said, "We are now being given so much weaponry, not because, as some say, the West is helping us, not because they want the best for us, but because we perform the tasks set by the West, because we are the only ones who are ready to do them. Because we have fun. We have fun killing, and we have fun fighting." Now, this is the leader of an organization which is explicitly neo-Nazi in its outlook, and you'll hear more from him in a second. On November 7th, 2019, the European Parliament, the vice president of a commission under the security policy grouping of the European Parliament, admitted that members of C14 have been charged with hate crimes, distributing racist materials, and attacking minorities. Well, these are people who are known as Nazis. The State Department characterized C14 as a hate group and identified that in their annual report on terrorists and hate groups. But when a challenge was made in a Ukrainian court, when they protested being called neo-Nazis, a Ukrainian appeals court ruled that they are not a neo-Nazi group. But listen to what Karas had to say further, where he self-identified as a Nazi. He said, well, we were hearing that there were not many Nazis on Maidan. That's a reference to the Maidan Square where the coup was carried out in February 2014. He said they said maybe only about 10% of real ideological Nazis. And he said, well, maybe not even 10%, maybe even less, maybe 8%. But how much they are much more effective in proportion of influence, how much their effectiveness was endless. He's talking about his group. He said, if not for those 8%, the effectiveness of Maidan would have dropped by 90%. And he said there weren't that many nationalists, but if not for the nationalists, referring to himself and his colleagues, including the Azov Battalion, another well-known Nazi formation, he said, if not for that, the whole thing would have turned into a gay parade. That is, the demonstrations supposedly for freedom and democracy in Ukraine only carried out the coup because of the Nazi presence. Now, I just want to give you a couple more examples of the recognition of this, and you can see how the lies are designed, especially now, to tar the leadership of Putin and to deny the reality that was known by everyone and is known by everyone, including in Ukraine. Reuters in March 2018 had an article titled Ukraine's Neo-Nazi Problem. And it said there's a growing problem of far-right vigilantes who use intimidation and even violence to advance their agendas, and who often do so with the tacit approval of law enforcement agencies. And the article goes on to say that, well, some people say these militias have been reined in. They have, in fact, been integrated into Ukraine's armed forces. And they refer there to Azov Battalion leader Andrei Beletsky, who was an advisor to the former interior minister and also an advisor to the former chief of staff of the Ukrainian military. Now, why is this important? The Azov Battalion is one of the leading elements of the fighting in Donbass against the Russian population. And by fighting, I mean murder. The destructive genocidal attack on people who are Russian ethnic, but who are Ukrainian, who live in Ukraine. The whole issue in eastern Ukraine is that after the coup in February 2014, there were constitutional changes which took away their freedom, took away their right to speak Russian in the Donbass region. And so what we've seen is a fight going on there, which is a fight of the people there to defend themselves from these so-called nationalists who I self-identify as Nazis. The Azov Battalion leader, for example, Beletsky, once said, quote, he will lead the white races in a final crusade against Semite-led Untermenschen. Untermenschen was the name the Nazis gave to non-Aryans, especially to the Jews they marched off to their death. So you had this Reuters article. Now, interestingly, in June 2014, the Atlantic Council, which is one of the leading cheerleaders for Ukraine against Russia and the pushing for a war to punish Russia, the Atlantic Council had an article called The Battle for Mariupol, which was during this period of time when the so-called right-wing nationalists were out to destroy the Russian population. And it was written by a reporter who was embedded in the Azov Battalion, who openly identified them as right-wing and neo-Nazis. This was in the Atlantic Council's own publication. And then in 2018, there was an article put out on the Atlantic Council website, quote, Ukraine's got a real problem with far-right violence, unquote. But then in 2020, their line had changed. They have an article which goes into the question of why Azov should not be designated a foreign terrorist organization. And they admitted in this article that Azov's ideology comes from neo-Nazi beliefs, but must be accepted because it is, quote, an integral part of official structures of the state, unquote, and follows orders given by the interior minister. So In this case, there's an admission by the Atlantic Council that the Interior Minister is ordering these Nazi units embedded in the security and defense forces in Ukraine to attack the Russian population. The article concludes that to call these groups government-sponsored Nazi, a government-sponsored Nazi group would be a, quote, gift to the Kremlin, unquote. In other words, telling the truth would be a gift to the Kremlin. Now, that's where you can see an element of how the leading weapon being deployed in this situation is the media, the think tanks, the academics, the creation of a narrative which is far removed from reality. In fact, attacks reality, those people who are presenting reality, as the ones who are making up stories. Now, Dennis mentioned this so-called attack on the nuclear plant in Ukraine, the Zaporizhzhia plant, which they say was shelled by Russian forces, and that this could have been a new Chernobyl. It could be considered a nuclear, the front end of a nuclear attack on the Ukrainian people by the Russians, only there's one problem with the story. The Russians weren't shelling it. The Russian forces were already in the plant. Why would they shell their own forces? And the fire that broke out was in a training area next to the nuclear plant, where the fire was set by the Ukrainian saboteurs who were trying to attack the Russian forces in the nuclear plant. Did you read that in the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN? No, they're essentially saying the madman Putin was preparing to blow up Ukraine's largest, actually one of the largest nuclear power plants in all of Europe, to destroy the people of Ukraine. Now, all of this is being done for the sake of defending a collapsing world order. And I just want to finish with this point. What many people have not yet come to realize because of the lies is that those people in the United States who reacted against the globalist elites who are attacking the Bush Republicans, the Clinton Democrats, and others because they're taking away sovereignty from the United States, what they don't realize is that Russia and China are leading a fight globally to defend the concept of sovereign nations acting in the interests of their country in cooperation with other nations. This is the principle of the Peace of Westphalia. Who was the leader in the world in trying to take down this principle? It was Tony Blair, who in the end of the 90s and all through the period of the last 20-something years has carried out a campaign under the slogan, responsibility to protect, which is really an excuse for regime change of any government which refuses to submit to the order of the post-Cold War of the unipolar order run by the City of London and Wall Street. If you oppose that, then you're authoritarian and therefore a target for regime change. And as we saw from the quotes from Bruno Le Maire, and you can find many, many more quotes like this, the Russians will have to pay, the Russian people will have to pay the price. And the implication is that any other nation, especially nations not as powerful as Russia, must submit or they'll be destroyed. And so from that standpoint, the fact that 27 African nations refused to knuckle under to the pressure to vote to condemn Russia in the UN General Assembly shows the opposition to this world order. We saw it with the Indian response at the Quad. We see it with countries in Asia, with countries in Eastern Europe. The opposition to this world order, I should say Central Europe. So what all this portends is that the fight that's being waged is not about Ukraine per se, and the people of Ukraine are the victims of the NATO-US drive to crush Russia. And that's something you should remember when you're watching this on television, that you're being induced to support a war that ultimately is going to take away your freedom.
Thank you, Harley. Let me just reference for people so we punctuate this. That Harley referred to Yevhen Karas, who's the leader of C-14. And for any of you who just joined us, you may not have heard that quote, who said, we perform the tasks set by the West because we are the only ones who are ready to do them, because we have fun killing and we have fun fighting. Now, the person that formed the youth movement called C-14 was a person by the name of Oleg Tyanibok. And we want to show a picture of him meeting with Biden in the spring of 2014. We'd like to show another picture of him, which was not his meeting with Biden, but this is who he is. And he is the founder of the youth movement, which is called C-14. This poses for anyone who is either Russian or Ukrainian a very important problem, and one that we have to say that many, many decades ago now, the Schiller Institute pioneered some work in this area. There's a book that we wrote at the time called the Hitler Book. And what the Hitler Book did was to not talk about merely the German experience of fascism, but the way in which what was called at the time universal fascism actually functioned. We're going to do, there's a character or a level that needs to be introduced here. Helga Zepp-LaRouche headed up the project called the Hitler Book Project. And actually, some almost over 20 years ago, once talked about how the process called globalization had been identified by Alan Greenspan back in 2000. He said that, well, we once had globalization before in 1913. We thought it was going to go on forever, but then something happened the next year. It was called World War I. The problem of tragedy, the problem of what we are dealing with right now today is a lack of leadership. And there's an issue that was addressed by Helga Zepp-LaRouche 25 years ago in a conference that was given in September of 1997. We're going to show a video, and I'm going to ask my co-host Diane Sayre to respond to this video. This is picked up in the middle of the speech, and what Helga is describing is the concept of tragedy. She's talking about the issue of the Greeks and the idea of how the Greeks thought about what it took to be a hero in a time of adversity. And then she briefly alludes to the problem of having a president or head of state incapable of rising above the limitations and the degeneracy of the society of which they are part. So if we can have that video now, and then we'll have Diane's response to it.
For the Greek, the heroes are those people who exactly are heroes because they are perceptive for the suffering of mankind, and they are able to feel deeply and tender, but they are not overwhelmed. They love life passionately, but not so much that they could not give it up for the sake of humanity. Schiller says, for the Greek, fame is never dullness and indifference, but in the bearing of the suffering with all the compassion for it. This tender sensitiveness for the suffering, this warm, honest, truthful, and openly presented nature, which moves us so deeply and lively in the Greek tragedies, has become the law which the Greek genius has given to the classical art, Schiller says. The presentation of mere passion, both the lascivious and the embarrassing one, is vulgar. It's the sincere emotion. The resistance of the intellect against that is what is noble, and nothing is noble which does not come from reason. Schiller has only says there is only one means to save man from worsening, and that is to safeguard his heart against weakness. And he says one major role in doing that is the great drama on stage, because for the large class of fools and idiots, he says that, he's polemical, for the large class of fools, it's a mirror where they receive a healthy ridicule, irony, and satire. And without blushing, we can recognize our weakness. Theater, more than any other public institution, is a guide through life, an unmistaken key to the most secret inroads of the human soul. Schiller says, obviously there are people who refuse that, who are selfish and have a hardening of the conscience and cold hearts and prevent that this ennobling effect takes place. And he says maybe there have been not less robberies and murders because of great art, even though he does not exclude it to be contrary. But he says once we see the great destinies and the great crimes on stage, we at least know them, and we experience an inoculation. We are never surprised. And it is what Schiller calls the great destiny which ennobles man even if it smashes him. Now this is a very important idea, because we are going into hard times and we want to be ennobled even if destiny would smash us. Now I'm not intending that it does, but we have to keep our dignity and our honor no matter what comes, because you have to be the missionaries who help the people around you. You have to have the soul strength, because people will turn to you, and you have to give them exactly that. Now, the horrors to come, well, you have to imagine the whole history right now as a big stage, and all the people, they are the audience. And then a statesman comes on the stage who reflects the immorality of the people, immorality of the people which threatens their existence, and the leading figure has a good dose of it himself. Now, you could write a theater play right now, and you could have a president of a large country which, by the circumstances, is the only place left from which the tragedy can be avoided. Now, if this hero in this modern drama acts in the wrong way, civilization is destroyed. And, so you are the audience. You are not the audience, you are part of the people on the stage. Therefore, the approach of Schiller and of Lynn, namely to concentrate on the subjective question, how to ennoble, how to develop the individual, is indeed key for the political outcome of this crisis. This is why the pedagogical presentations of science and great art is so important, and people must engage. They must, in a certain sense, look at your mind, look at your soul, and then say, I have to push the envelope. I have to make my heart bigger. I have to make my mind more functioning. So, therefore, in each case, when we do that, we communicate ideas which are located in the sovereign inner process of your own mind, and you are addressing it to the inner sovereign process of another person. Therefore, we have to reject the idea that knowledge is objective facts, but it is this subjective communication. Your mind subjectively reaches into the subjective mind of another person. And this can only occur through metaphor, through paradoxes, through hypothesis. Because you have to approach the inner faculty of the other person, that faculty which is capable of hypothesis in the other person. And for that you need the passion of a mountain climber for truth. You need the kind of revolutionary passion willing to overturn entire doctrines, and that passion is called agape. It's what Schiller calls the philosophical mind, the person who loves truth more than the system, who is willing to take it apart himself, to put it together more perfect. It's the ability to sustain the mental energy and to concentrate, to make the necessary breakthrough which solves the paradox, and to take the emotional strength to get rid of the pathologies which disrupt your cognitive powers. Because it is those neuroses which eat up mental energies, and what should be the mental energy of you is your creativity. Now, this is why it is only the classical humanist form of education which represents the solution. what the Brothers of the Common Life did, what Wilhelm von Humboldt did, who basically said that the students have to confront paradoxes not in the virtual domain of formalism, but in the actual universe. That by step, going through the process of meeting successive paradoxes, of going each time through the suspense, the tension, which lifts the thinker over each obstacle, the continuous process of such thinking and struggling, this is what forms the character of the pupil. And therefore Wilhelm von Humboldt said that the goal of education is not the specific knowledge, the expertise, but the building of the beauty of the character. Die Ausbildung des Menschen zu einem harmonischen Ganzen. The building of the personality of the person to a harmonious totality. Not being able to surf the internet like a super duper crack, not to play the piano and know nothing else, but it is the totality of the person, the aesthetical character. This is what makes people Staatsbürger, state citizens. And only if you educate state citizens, and Nikolaus of Cusa even requires that every state citizen has to know the knowledge, the entire knowledge of your time, to be able to have adequate foreknowledge. Because the moral accountability of one's own acts and omissions is determined by this foreknowledge of the person. That conscience which causes one to act to stop the famine in North Korea and the genocide in Africa is exactly that. Where does the faculty of this foreknowledge reside? It is that which is partially existing in man and perfect existing in God. It's the elementary question of competent Christian theology. It is what Lynn called so beautifully God's existence in the simultaneity of eternity. And as Lynn has demonstrated many times, the only proof we mortal beings have for that is Plato's method of the higher hypothesis. Because in all known cultures, the characteristic of a successful economic behavior is the fact that man is capable of making changes in the modes of behavior governed by foreknowledge of the future and to make adequate choices. In this way, the future acts on the present for better or for worse, depending what we choose. And it is this series of hypotheses generated by a constant principle of change, which is what Plato calls the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. It is that which obliges us to again and again replace repeatedly our underlying beliefs about nature. And if we apply or fail to apply those, history has a happy or a sad result for future generations.
Now we're going to argue, if you've just joined us, you're watching the LaRouche organization's Saturday program, The True Cause for the Start of World War III. We're going to argue that what you just heard is the only way to approach a solution for the present circumstance. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has written a petition, which is now in circulation, called Convoke an International Conference to Establish a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations. And this is the standpoint from which, in fact, the Ukraine and any other crisis can be resolved. So I want to have my co-host, Diane Sayer, say something about this.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, I've actually been thinking, in a sense, we have been groomed for such a war for some time, and Helga really identifies in a sense, the cultural preparation for it. If you think about what happens to people on the social media, right? There are algorithms and there's money because of advertising. I don't think it's only for the money, but it is also for the money, where there is a decision made over what you are going to be fed, what you are going to see. Since they get more advertising if you stay on longer, then you are fed things that you're likely to agree with or engage in, which means, one, that you have a population that is increasingly divided because no one ever gets to see the content that the people who disagree with them are looking at. It also means that you are creating a real watering down of emotional strength. I remember my father, when I was a girl, there were certain shows my sister and I would watch, and we'd cry every time. And he would say, "You're still watching these tear jerkers? Why are you watching?" And I see it now because they have these insidious things on Facebook, the story of a poor homeless person who lost everything, but when they see a man who's trying to fill his car and doesn't have any money, or his wallet gets stolen, they go over and give the person their last $20. And people get all emotionally wrapped up in this. Isn't this beautiful? Isn't this good? Very superficial, but very intense. Now, you combine this shallowness of emotion together with the violence of video games, desensitizing people to killing other human beings, the isolation even further exacerbated, the isolation already of the social media exacerbated by the pandemic and the social distancing. And then you give us a war in which you are bombarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by not merely propaganda, but propaganda which is geared exactly to cohere with the grooming that we have received. There are 16,000 mercenaries that are now going over to fight in this war. Why would you want to do that? Just step back a minute. Is Russia militarily capable of wiping Ukraine off the map? Yes, they are. I don't think Putin wants to do that, but who would say, now I know Blinken says that Ukraine can beat Russia absurdly, but who would think that is just looking, suppose the war didn't happen, who would be more likely to win a war between Russia and Ukraine? Okay, so what's the point of, and the United States has said repeatedly, we're not going to send troops into Ukraine officially, and we're not going to go to nuclear war, and Russia has disavowed nuclear war. Now, I'm not saying this won't go to nuclear war, that's not my point, but I'm saying, what is the mindset of someone who would enlist to go over there and fight in something which you know that you cannot possibly win in that way? It's all of this emotional tragic, as we were shown in 1990-91, that Saddam Hussein's troops had supposedly been running into Kuwait and yanking babies out of incubators, which turned out not to be true. Or we see the New York Post, entire Ukrainian family killed and their dog. And so we're supposed to be extremely, and Zelensky is an actor, a comedian, so he comes on and says, and they were going to blow up the nuclear power plant, which could have obliterated the entirety of all of Europe. So people are being sucked into this horrific meat grinder, even literally to lay down their physical life in the form of becoming a mercenary, or simply your emotional identity. And I think we have to be very, very conscious of this, because even people who initially said, yes, I know it's a legitimate concern that Russia does not want nuclear missiles on their border. People remember or may know something about the Cuban Missiles Crisis and Kennedy's actions to prevent nuclear warheads in Cuba and the risks that he took. But even people who, in a sense, know that are getting jumbled up, confused, and twisted around. And you have this entire romantic idea of the war. There are streams on social media of all of the absolutely beautiful women who have joined. Miss Ukraine is fighting, and the wife of the vice president. What is this? And I think it's very urgent that we do a job in making people self-conscious of how you are being brainwashed and manipulated, and what are the wider implications. And the way that you reverse this, the way that you can snap yourself out of this, is what Helga said, is to actually work on this question of love of mankind, love of someone that you never met, love of a child that might be in Afghanistan right now dying of starvation, and what the parents of that child might be going through or thinking at this moment. And then from that standpoint, deciding what would be the proper course of action. And therefore, this statement, as Dennis just said, convoking a conference for these noble aims, a Treaty of Westphalia approach, a total reorganization of the financial system, is absolutely doable, because the wonderful thing about human beings, for good and for bad, but I would say in this case we have to make it for the good, is that your emotional relationship to reality can be transformed in a flash. And I think we're on the cusp, perhaps, of something very good occurring, but we have to cause it to occur consciously. Otherwise, we are on an exceedingly dangerous trajectory, not the least of which are these emotional, psychological factors, which Helga identified and I wanted to underscore.
Thank you very much, Diane. And we're going to have two other presentations. I wanted the people to know, to have an idea about this. If you've just joined us, the title for today's program is The True Cause for the Start of World War III. It's a takeoff on the title of an article that was written by Carl Osgood some time ago, which he had a problem getting published, which probably would have been a good idea at the time, because it might have given people a much better idea about what's going on right now. And so we're going to go to Carl in a moment, but I just want to say about the presentation that Mike will be giving. This one, and people who've seen Mike here before from UK Column know that we often talk about how his job is to sort of tell you how much worse it's about to get. And what Helga went through is going to stand you in good stead for those of you that pay close attention when you get to his presentation. So we're going to hear from Carl first, military analyst for Executive Intelligence Review.
All right. Actually, I didn't really realize this until I heard Helga's remarks. But what I'm actually going to do is describe how misrepresenting and destroying past history is intended to determine the future by the same apparatus that we've been talking about all afternoon. Now, crucial to understanding why Russia is doing what it's doing in Ukraine and with respect to NATO is the issue of what is the truth about the prehistory of World War II, particularly what became known as the Munich sellout of Czechoslovakia in September 1938. And there you have Chamberlain and Daladier and Hitler and Mussolini in Munich in 1938 after their agreement, at which Chamberlain called "peace in our time" when he got back to England. Now, 2019 was the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, but there was actually a drive in 2019 to blame the start of the war on Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union alone, with the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1938, discounting all that had went on before, going all the way back to the Versailles Treaty. These same revisionists were also attempting to put the full credit for the defeat of Nazi Germany into the hands of the US and Britain, not even mentioning the Red Army, which was responsible for inflicting 70% of the casualties, all of the casualties that the German army suffered in the war. So the Russian President Vladimir Putin wrote an article on this matter, which was published in the US in the magazine The National Interest in June of 2020. He presented his analysis of the causes of that horrendous disaster for mankind, with his own call for urgent measures today to prevent the crisis from ending in the same disaster, which in the age of thermonuclear weapons could end civilization as we know it. In doing so, Putin documented through the Soviet and other archives from that era that it was particularly the failure of British and Polish leaders, abetted by the failures of the Allies in general, to confront Adolf Hitler's ambitions in Eastern Europe. It was not the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, also known as the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 23, 1939, that set Europe on the path to war. In other words, Europe was on the path to war long before the Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed. It is a repeat of the tragedy of the 1941 to 1945 war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that Russia is seeking to prevent today. And that is what is behind the special military operation now ongoing in Ukraine to destroy the neo-Nazi formations. Here we see the Azov Brigade, the neo-Nazi formations that have dominated Ukrainian politics since 2014 and prevent the US-UK dominated NATO from using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia in the way that Hitler used Czechoslovakia as a lever for his ambitions towards Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. Today's Polish political elites, as well as the NATO-aligned political leaders in other countries, erupted in howls of protest, insisting that what Putin argued in his article was not true, that Hitler and Stalin together were responsible for the start of World War II, that only Hitler and Stalin were responsible for making Poland the first victim of the war through the 1939 division of Poland. But American diplomats had understood in 1937-38 that anti-Semitic violence and government legal actions akin to those in Germany were a huge problem in Poland, and they reported this reality back to Washington. American diplomats also understood that Czechoslovakia was key to Hitler's plans for occupying Eastern Europe, and that Poland stood in the way of defending Czechoslovakia's sovereignty because Warsaw was also eyeing a piece of that country's territory. These same diplomats also knew that Neville Chamberlain's British government planned to sell out Czechoslovakia to Hitler months before it happened, demonstrating that there would be no anti-Hitler coalition. All of this documentation has been available for decades, but it is ignored by those revisionists of today, some of whom have even posited that the US and the UK alone defeated Hitler, ignoring the fact that the vast majority of the war was fought within the Soviet Union and that 27 million Soviet citizens died in defeating the Nazi scourge. So in his article, Putin wrote that the blame for the tragedy that Poland then suffered lies entirely with the Polish leadership, which had impeded the formation of a military alliance between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and relied on the help from its Western partners, throwing its own people under the steamroller of Hitler's machines of destruction. The Soviet Union did its utmost to use every chance of creating an anti-Hitler coalition, despite, I will say it again, the double dealing on the part of the Western countries. Putin's concern is that there were signs today that the world could blunder into war yet again. Remember, he's writing this in 2020. The creation of the modern system of international relations is one of the major outcomes of the Second World War. Even the most insurmountable contradictions, geopolitical, ideological, economic, do not prevent us from finding forms of peaceful coexistence and interaction, if there is the desire and will to do so. Today, the world is going through quite a turbulent time. Everything is changing from the global balance of power and influence to the social, economic, and technological foundations of societies, nations, and even continents. In past epochs, shifts of such magnitude have almost never happened without major military conflicts, without a power struggle to build a new global hierarchy. Thanks to the wisdom and farsightedness of the political figures of the Allied powers, it was possible to create a system that restrained from extreme manifestations of such objective competition historically inherent in the world development. It is a duty of ours, all of those who take political responsibility and primarily representatives of the victorious powers in the Second World War, to guarantee that this system is maintained and improved. Today, as in 1945, it is important to demonstrate political will and discuss the future together. Now, in this regard, Putin reiterated his call for a five-power summit among Russia, China, the US, the UK, and France, which would discuss the issues of preserving peace, to include not only security matters and arms control, but also to take up the situation in the global economy, particularly with respect to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the direct trigger that led to Putin's article was a resolution voted up in the European Parliament on September 19, 2019, which put equal responsibility for the start of World War II on Hitler's Germany and the Soviet Union, as if it began with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the August 23rd Hitler-Stalin agreement, before the Nazi invasion of Poland. Putin writes, whereas 80 years ago on 23rd of August 1939, the Communist Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a treaty of non-aggression known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its secret protocols, dividing Europe and the territories of independent states between the two totalitarian regimes and grouping them into spheres of interest, which paved the way for the outbreak of the Second World War. He immediately followed this saying, as a direct consequence of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, followed by the Nazi-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty of 20th of September 1939, the Polish Republic was invaded first by Hitler and 2 weeks later by Stalin, which stripped the country of its independence and wasn't... Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading from the European Parliament resolution, not from Putin. So they say that the Polish Republic was invaded first by Hitler and 2 weeks later by Stalin, which stripped this country of its independence and was an unprecedented tragedy for the Polish people. Later in the resolution, the EP maintains, Russia remains the greatest victim of communist totalitarianism and that its development into a democratic state will be impeded as long as the government, the political elite, and political propaganda continue to whitewash communist crimes and glorify the Soviet totalitarian regime. The EP therefore calls on Russian society to come to terms with its tragic past. The EP is therefore deeply concerned about the efforts of the current Russian leadership to distort historical facts and whitewash crimes committed by the Soviet totalitarian regime and considers them a dangerous component of the information war waged against a democratic Europe that aims to divide Europe and therefore calls on the Commission to decisively counteract these efforts. But the European Parliament resolution didn't even mention the Munich sellout of Czechoslovakia. Putin, during a Commonwealth of Independent States Heads of Summit meeting on December 20th, 2019, told the assembled heads of states that he was surprised and somewhat hurt by the EP resolution. He said the EP reference to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact begged the question, was this the only document signed by one of the European countries, back then the Soviet Union, with Nazi Germany? It turns out that this is not at all the case. He then proceeded to list a series of agreements European powers signed with Nazi Germany from 1934 on, beginning with the declaration on the non-use of force between Germany and Poland, followed by the Anglo-German Maritime Agreement of 1935, the Joint Anglo-German Declaration of Chamberlain and Hitler signed on September 30th, 1938, and several others involving France, Lithuania, and Latvia. Putin wrote, thus the treaty between the Soviet Union and Germany was the last in a line of treaties signed by European countries that seemed to be interested in maintaining peace in Europe. Putin also stressed that the roots of World War II were in fact planted by the Versailles Treaty of 1919, the treaty that ended World War I. Later in his remarks, Putin highlighted the role that Poland played in the pre-war geopolitical maneuvering in Eastern Europe, particularly with respect to Czechoslovakia, using documents from the Soviet archives. He referred to a conversation with French President Edouard Daladier as recorded in one of these documents, in which Daladier said he saw no reason in a Franco-Polish alliance and the sacrifices that France was making as part of it. Putin said, so what does this mean? It means the Soviet Union was ready to help Czechoslovakia, which Nazi Germany was going to rob. But the agreement between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia stated that the Soviet Union would do this only if France fulfilled its obligations to Czechoslovakia. France linked its aid to Czechoslovakia to support from Poland, but Poland refused to provide it. Let me note as an aside on this, for Soviet troops to aid Czechoslovakia, they would have to march through Poland. And so if the Polish refused to allow this, then the French were not going to come to the aid of Czechoslovakia. So this is actually reflected in other documents, and U.S. documents, which I'll get to in a minute. The next document that Putin referred to reported that as Germany was laying claim to parts of Czechoslovakia, Poland also laid claim to their part of the prey during the partition of Czechoslovak territory and demanded that a certain part of Czechoslovakia be transferred to them. Moreover, they were ready to use force. They formed a special military group called Silesia, which included 3 infantry divisions, a cavalry brigade, and other units. In fact, after the Nazi takeover of parts of Czechoslovakia, Poland grabbed a piece of northeastern Moravia, which was right on the southeastern corner of the Polish border, southwestern corner rather. Not surprisingly, the response from the Polish government to Putin's remarks to the CIS summit and his follow-up remarks to the Russian Defense Ministry Board a few days later was one of complete hysteria. In a statement issued on December 21st, the Polish Foreign Ministry wrote, "We are concerned and disbelieving to note the statements made by representatives of the Russian Federation authorities, including President Vladimir Putin, about the causes and course of the Second World War. They allude to the propaganda messages of the Stalin totalitarian era, already condemned even by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev." The statement went on to detail what it said were crimes committed against Poland by the Soviet Union, both before and after the German invasion, including, among others, an August 1937 order by the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, by which, quote, 111,000 Poles, Soviet citizens, were murdered and several dozen thousand more were deported or arrested. Now, what did American diplomats know at the same time as the documents that Putin referred to were being written? So I reviewed 75 pages of documents that were published in the 1938 volume of the Foreign Relations of the United States, which is the series U.S. State Department's official history. This section was titled Analyses and Reports of the General Political Developments in Europe Affecting the Maintenance of International Order and the Preservation of Peace. This shows that American diplomats knew in general Hitler's intention towards Czechoslovakia, that Poland had designs of its own on a portion of that country, about Britain's policy of appeasement of Germany, and that the Soviet Union was really the only country that might potentially defend Czech sovereignty. Central to this is a diplomat, the U.S. Secretary of State by the name of George Messersmith. He wrote in a lengthy memorandum dated February 18, 1938, which was addressed to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He pans the notion, apparently current in Europe at the time, that Hitler might actually intend to abide by agreements that he had signed. Messersmith wrote, "I have myself never been able to understand why these illusions should persist when Hitler himself, in his book and in the statements in which he was statements which he has made privately and semi-publicly, has never left any doubt as to his political practice, according to which agreements are valid only as long as he believes that they should be kept. It would seem that recent events should therefore convince a certain group in England, which has been fostering such agreements, how utterly futile and fatal is any idea that they can make lasting and binding agreements with Germany under present conditions. And yet there would seem to be indications that English policy is more than ever oriented in the direction of such agreements." Here he was referring to both Austria and Czechoslovakia. On February 21st, William Bullitt, the U.S. ambassador in Paris, reported that the French Foreign Minister, Yvonne Delbos, told him that the British government had made it clear that Britain would do nothing to prevent the absorption of Austria by Germany. France could not alone attempt to protect Austria. It was clear, therefore, that Austria, within a very limited time, would fall into the hands of Germany, which it did about a month later. It would then be the turn of Czechoslovakia. Bullitt writes further, "Delbos showed me a note which he had just received from Chamberlain, in which it was asserted that there would be no change in British policy. He commented that this note was, of course, valueless. The fact was that England had embarked on a policy of turning over Central and Eastern Europe to Germany, in spite of her obligations under the League of Nations." On March 2nd, the U.S. minister in Prague, a man named Carr, reported that Edvard Beneš, the president of Czechoslovakia, believed that Germany will want to negotiate, and he is ready to negotiate within the framework of complete loyalty to England and France, who would be informed of every step, and the reservation that the negotiations shall not involve intervention in Czechoslovak internal affairs. Given what Delbos had told Bullitt a little over a week earlier, this seems to have been a forlorn hope. The following day, March 3rd, Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State, reported that the British ambassador in Washington told him that Chamberlain had instructed the British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Neville Henderson, to seek an audience with Hitler to ascertain two things. The first of these of which was on Germany's colonial ambitions, and then the second, quote, "the precise extent and nature of Germany's attitude with regard to a permanent Central European appeasement." Andrew Biddle, the U.S. ambassador in Poland, reported on March 12th that his sources in London and Paris that what Henderson reported back to Chamberlain was that what Hitler wanted in Central Europe was a free hand for Germany and Austria and Sudetendeutsch. Sudetendeutsch is a reference to the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia that Hitler had his eyes on. There's much more along this vein that's in these documents that I could go through, but there are two documents which are particularly prescient. On August 17th, the American chargé d'affaires in London, a diplomat by the name of Herschel Johnson, reported on a conversation he had the night before with the Russian ambassador in London. His name was Ivan Maysky, and what he took to be the official Soviet Foreign Office view of Germany's objectives in Eastern Europe. Quote, the picture he drew is also of interest as part of the background which provided this account as a sound one. Notice that Johnson had his doubts. Must presumably have great influence on the mind of Hitler in any decision he will have to make regarding the solution of the Czechoslovak question. For according to this theory, if Hitler loyally accepts a peaceful settlement between the Czechs and the Sudetendeutsch for a regime which will fully maintain the sovereignty of Czechoslovakia as it now exists, he will have accepted the most serious single impediment to Nazi plans for German expansion in southeastern Europe. According to Monsieur Maysky, the dispute with Czechoslovakia is being used as simply the opening wedge in Germany's struggle for continental domination. If Hitler succeeds in mutilating Czechoslovakia and reducing what is left to a position of political and economic vassalage, he will have opened the door to the creation of a solid bloc of states extending to the Black Sea. He will thereby have gained access to Romanian oil and the wheat fields of Hungary, which will make Germany largely self-sustaining. Furthermore, with Czechoslovakia out of the way, the Danubian and Balkan countries will be unable to resist the pressure which Germany will bring to bear upon them, Maysky said. Johnson continued that Hitler envisages the inclusion of Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria in a strict customs union with Germany, to be further implemented by military conventions designed to give the German General Staff complete control of their armies. Maysky believed that Germany would not stop at that, but the question was, would Hitler go east or west? To go east could only be directed at Russia, which Maysky thought was unlikely, at least not for the next 5 to 10 years, by which time he believed that Russia would be ready for it. Instead, he thought Germany would turn on Belgium and the Netherlands next, with their rich colonial possessions. So Johnson goes on. Maysky's idea that Czechoslovakia is the key to the whole situation in Central Europe is of course shared by nearly all commentators. The idea that Maysky was working on, however, was that as far as Germany's future plans are concerned, it is not so much a question of whether she attempts to settle the Czechoslovak question at once by force, or whether she accomplishes the same purpose by other means. It is in the accomplishment of the purpose that the danger of the future lies. He was emphatic in expressing his conviction that Hitler should not be allowed to destroy Czechoslovakia, and that the time to prevent that destruction was now. At the same time, he said efforts should be made by the Western powers within the limit of the possibility to lessen the growing burden of dependence on Germany, which is now falling on the Danubian countries, none of whom want to be sucked into the German maelstrom. In a memo written a few days later, following the receipt of Johnson's cable, Messerschmitt wrote to Hull that the Russian view of German intentions should not be simply dismissed. He wrote, there might be a tendency to minimize the views expressed in this telegram coming as they do from a Soviet ambassador. I would like to say that in my opinion, I believe that the Soviet ambassador has given a fairly correct view of what the real German objectives are. I base this opinion on my long experience and considerable personal contact with the leaders in the present German government. The objectives which the Soviet ambassador has attributed to the present German government accord with those which I have heard high-ranking officers of the German government express to me directly or by implication from time to time. Messerschmitt knew of what he was speaking. He had been the U.S. consul in Berlin from 1930 to 1934, where he became famous for being the diplomat who approved the visa for Albert Einstein, allowing him to come to the U.S. In 1934, Messerschmitt became minister to Austria, where he stayed until going back to the State Department in 1937. So he's certainly in a position to know the thinking of the then present German government. So he continued, the emphasis which I believe the Soviet ambassador places upon the importance of the German objectives in Czechoslovakia is not too great. The first part of the comprehensive German program involves domination of Austria and Czechoslovakia so as to open the way to Romanian oil, without which Germany cannot make war. as well as free access to the raw materials and agricultural products of Southeastern Europe. The first step in the German program is domination of Southeastern Europe as this is necessary if any further progress is to be made. This is the reason why I consider and have considered for the last 4 years that the German objectives in Czechoslovakia are definite and unalterable. If Germany should accept any solution to the Czechoslovak problem, which does not give her domination and control of that country, her whole program for expansion in any direction is stopped. At the end, Messerschmitt wrote, "I'm convinced that Czechoslovakia has for Germany a primary importance that, if she fails in her objectives there, it means a stoppage of her whole program. As the present regime cannot change any of its objectives without its whole program falling down, and as the Czechoslovak objective is among all these the most vital, I see no let-up on the pressure on Czechoslovakia and the danger of war over this question constantly present and not to be minimized." So it becomes clear in going through, reviewing these documents, that American diplomats had roughly the same picture of what was going on in Eastern Europe, what Hitler's intentions towards Czechoslovakia were, and that British policy was basically to give Eastern Europe to Germany, to Hitler's Germany. Any reasonable person can discover, therefore, that what Putin wrote in his June 2020 article in the National Interest was, in fact, historically accurate, and that this is the history that is now being buried under this avalanche of propaganda attempting to demonize Russia and Putin as the source of all evil in the world. So that's that concludes my presentation. I will certainly be willing to entertain any questions that people may have.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. We already have questions, and we will be getting to you on those questions. Let me just say to people, if they've just joined, that you're watching the LaRouche Organization webcast entitled "The True Cause for the Start of World War III." We've just reviewed the start of World War II and the dispute that had happened between Vladimir Putin and various persons from the European Union and other countries concerning the historical record. This went on back 2 years ago at a time when the idea had been put forward that there should be a kind of review and generalized public review and discussion about that history in order to be able to avoid the reemergence of war at that time. Mike Robinson, who's been with us several times from UK Column, has been sounding the alarm about something else for years. And that has to do with what people keep referring to as censorship, but is actually a form of warfare, which is presently being conducted against the populations of Europe and the United States, as well as other parts of the world. It's not merely war propaganda in the normal sense. It's the fact that while the attention is being directed at a shadow war called Ukraine-Russia, something else is happening in our countries. And that which is happening is that the entire structure of government, or at least of public discourse, is being completely eviscerated before your eyes, but you're not seeing it. And therefore, everybody's yelling and screaming about democracy and freedom in Ukraine without recognizing that very idea is being taken away in your own countries. And so I've asked Mike to come on and tell us what his view is of things that are happening, not just in terms of Ukraine, Russia, but also things that are happening both in England, but also that as a trend marker, trend line for what's happening otherwise in the transatlantic world. So, Mike, you're up.
Thanks, Dennis. Right, we'll start off. Diane said in her presentation, that we're experiencing, what did she say, propaganda geared to the grooming that we've been experiencing for quite a long time about Russia and so on. And that propaganda, that grooming has been, well, we might use the term full spectrum, because it's not just the mainstream press, it's also social media. And well, in fact, with respect to Ukraine, we have, in the UK at least, we have had bridges lit up in blue and yellow, other public infrastructure lit up blue and yellow. We've had so-called social media influencers who normally are talking about everything from fashion to art or whatever it happens to be, suddenly talking about the Ukraine. These are clearly being groomed themselves to start pushing a slightly political narrative. And so it is a huge propaganda operation that's going on at the moment. And of course, as Diane mentioned, opposing voices don't get the opportunity to express themselves. Now, I'm just going to go back over a little bit of the stuff that I've covered in the past, but I just want to make a couple of points here. So if we just bring this on screen. Now, in 2017, Amber Rudd, who was the Home Secretary in the UK at the time, and Theresa May brought all the social media companies into 10 Downing Street and basically told them it was time to start regulating the internet, and they're particularly concerned about narratives on the internet. So this is part of the attack on the minds of the general public, is that only one side of any particular story is ever presented to them. And so the government was wondering how were they going to manage that. They brought the tech companies in to begin this discussion. So it went on. We started seeing discussion about the same kind of thing happening at a G7 level. So the G7 was also demanding that the internet giants, as it's described in this segment here, crack down on extremist content at that point. And as we move on, then we have the rise of the fact checkers, because one way to shut down narratives is to produce a group of people which governments claim are therefore the bastion of knowledge, the people that go around and check the facts that are out there on the internet and debunk anything which is counter to the mainstream narrative or the government narrative. And who's behind it? Well, Google, George Soros, they were backing the fact-checking organizations. And the next thing that is really key here is this principle of trust. And so we see many mainstream media organizations getting involved in the Trust Project, which was established a few years ago. And of course, the concept of trust is that if you trust your media source, if your media source is trusted, you don't have to question what it is they're telling you because you trust their words. You don't have to check the facts for yourself. And in fact, they're working to make sure that there is no opportunity to find any facts which might go counter to the narrative. But then the other problem for government, in the UK at least, was what about the mainstream press? The mainstream press under significant commercial pressure as a result of reduced advertising revenues and so on. So the government set up in the UK an inquiry to work out how to support the mainstream media. So Matt Hancock, who was the Secretary of State for Culture and Media at the time, announced a government intervention to support mainstream media. And that resulted in what was being called the Cairncross Review, as how it was launched, and so on. We've mentioned this before, but the key point was that the government in the UK at least wanted to find a way to reinforce the mainstream media, because there was a risk that the mainstream media on a commercial level was not going to survive. On top of that, then, we had increased government surveillance on what was going on within social media over the last few years. So Theresa May set up within the Cabinet Office in the UK government a rapid response unit, as they described it, which was there to watch and assess and gather intelligence about what information was being shared on social media, who's sharing it, what types of organizations were sharing it, and so on. And that, of course, is being used to help counter those narratives, because once they identified the key people who were pushing out counter-government narratives on social media, then that same rapid response unit was setting up effectively back channels of communication with the social media companies, and therefore making complaints about certain posts, having posts deplatformed or having entire channels deplatformed. And so this led up to the creation of the so-called Online Harms White Paper, which was a government document which was a precursor to legislation. Now, that legislation hasn't yet come into Parliament for review, but it is going to be in the next few weeks. And so this piece of legislation, I mean, the UK government, we've got to understand, is absolutely leading the charge for bringing in legislation to regulate the internet and regulate the narratives on the internet. Now, although the UK is ahead of the game here, the EU is following up very closely with the Digital Services Act, as they're calling it. I haven't seen equivalent legislation coming into the United States yet, but certainly Britain and the European Union very much pushing forward with this. So let's just briefly look at what they're talking about here. So the social media platforms will need to ensure that illegal content is removed quickly and minimize the risk of it appearing. Well, most people would say that that is fair enough. But then social media companies will be required to defend the role of the press. Okay, think about that. The legislation is going to safeguard free speech, but the key tenet of this is that people will be allowed to say what they want to say, but they have no right to that information being heard by anybody else or read by anybody else or seen by anybody else. So in other words, this legislation will effectively put into law the ability or the requirement for social media companies to shadow ban or to delist any information from search engines, for example, Google and so on. It's going to only apply to companies that allow the sharing of user-generated content, because the social media platforms are, of course, the biggest platforms for mass sharing of counter-narratives, and that, therefore, is the key target for this. And they're setting up a regulator, a body within the United Kingdom to regulate companies that operate in the United Kingdom. So those companies aren't just British companies, those are global companies. This will include Google and Facebook, will be required to follow the UK legislation. So let's just look at this in a little bit more detail and consider the implications. So the largest and most popular social media companies will need to act on content which is lawful but still harmful. Now think about that. So earlier there we said take down illegal content, but actually the legislation is much broader than that. It's talking about lawful content, but content which is still harmful, such as misinformation or disinformation. But there is no definition within the draft legislation at this point as to what harm is, or what harmful means, or what misinformation is, or what disinformation is. So the scope of it is undefined, and also the legislation allows for scope creep through secondary legislation at a later date. So these terms, well, they're as broad as the government of the day would like. Freedom of expression, the bill will ensure that the UK can express themselves freely online and participate, but as we've said already, not necessarily actually be seen by anybody else. Democratic content, so there'll be a duty on social media companies to protect content which the government defines as democratically important. And so you might have a view about what that is. It's certainly not defined in the legislation. Journalistic content from recognized news publishers would have to be protected by the social media companies. So any counter-narrative has to be taken down by the social media companies, but recognized news publishers' content is protected by the social media companies, except there is a caveat there with citizen journalists, but this is, we believe, this is with respect to the likes of Bellingcat and so on, the types of organizations that we saw pushing so-called citizens journalist content with respect to the war in Syria. So the censorship aspect of this is one part of how the narrative is being controlled, but another part of how the narrative is being controlled is through the use of media development. Well, we mentioned this gentleman before on this program in one of the previous appearances, Andy Price. At one point, we didn't know what he looked like. He is working for the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. He's head of counter-disinformation and media development. And this is a very important mechanism by which narratives are built by the government. So this is what he looks like. Well, I really wanted at one point to find out a bit more about Andy Price and what he was doing. And so I put in a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign Office, which the Foreign Office confirmed that they held the information that I wanted, but they basically said, forget it, you're not getting it. It's not in the national interest. They claimed, in fact, it would undermine the effective operation of his duties and therefore adversely impact the UK's security. So they wouldn't tell me what this was about. But let's just have a look at what has been made public about this. The government takes the issue, the Foreign Office said, of disinformation as well as wider online manipulation very seriously. Disinformation, they said, is the deliberate creation and dissemination of false and or manipulated information that is intended to deceive and mislead audiences. Now, this definition isn't in the online safety bill legislation, but there is a definition of it. The Russian government, the Foreign Office said, persistently uses disinformation as a tool to destabilize perceived enemies. Now, the UK government always accuses their opposition of doing what they're doing themselves. But anyway, we'll move on. This was evident in the sustained Russian disinformation campaign following the attack in Salisbury. That's the Skripal attack, the Novichok attack, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, and remains so with Russia's destabilization of East Ukraine and beyond. We will continue to work with EU and international partners to constrain Russian government's ability to use disinformation and propaganda. Now, remember, this is a statement coming from the Foreign Office and with respect to their counter-disinformation and media development programme. They went on to say the Prime Minister announced at the Eastern Partnership Summit last year that the UK would be spending around £100 million over 5 years in the Eastern neighbourhood to counter disinformation. It is as important as ever that Russian speakers, wherever they are, have a choice in the media they consume and are able to access reliable and objective information. It is therefore vital that local, public and independent media serving Russian-speaking audiences can flourish. And they went on to say this financial year, this was 2019, we're investing approximately £8 million in supporting public service and independent media. This includes projects in the Baltic states, Ukraine, as well as pan-regional initiatives. In addition, we're working with governments in the Baltic states alongside the British Council and other partners to address issues such as media literacy and societal integration. Now, around the 2017, 2018, 2019 period as well, one of the other Foreign Office initiatives that we've talked about before was the Institute for Statecraft and their Integrity Initiative. And of course, they had a lot of media journalists, UK journalists as well, but journalists right across Europe as well, involved in this, attempting to push out information into the mainstream press, mainly about Russia. So this propaganda campaign that we've seen becoming really egregious in this last couple of weeks has actually been running for many, many years. And as Diane said, we have been being groomed about it. Now, the Integrity Initiative was fatally damaged by the publicity that it got a few years ago, but it is basically morphed into this organization, the Open Information Partnership. And as you can see, they say, among us are NGOs, charities, academics, think tanks, journalists, fact-checkers, and activists. In February 2019, we joined together in response to the rising tide of manipulated information in the news on social media across our public discourse. But the point is here, you can see the breadth of organizations that are actually involved in this propaganda operation. NGOs, charities, academics, think tanks, journalists. It's incredible. Now, around the same time, in October 2019, the Intelligence and Security Committee of the UK Parliament published a report which was entitled Russia. And this was really pushing the narrative that Russia had been heavily involved in manipulating British politics and using social media to do that. It's being described in the Press Gazette here as covert hostile state action. And if we look at the head of the committee that published the Intelligence and Security Committee report, on the day that we're urging, Julian Knight said, on the day that we're urging the government to get on with long-promised legislation to protect against online harms, that piles on the evidence that there can be no excuse for further delay to bring this legislation forward because Russia is such a damaging or dangerous, pushing out so much dangerous disinformation. It has to be countered. Now, around the same period of time, Consortium News published this. This was headlined, Reuters, BBC in covert UK programme to push Western agenda. Now, this is related to Andy Price's counter-disinformation and media development programme in the Foreign Office. And Consortium News here said, the new leaks illustrate in alarming detail how Reuters and the BBC, two of the largest and most distinguished news organisations in the world, attempted to answer the British Foreign Ministry's call for help in improving its ability to respond and promote our message across Russia and to counter the Russian government's narrative. Among the Foreign Commonwealth Office stated goals, according to the director of the Counter-Disinformation and Media Development Programme, that's Andy Price, was to weaken the Russian state's influence on its near neighbours. Now, the question is, what is media development? And the Consortium News article there mentions two organisations, Reuters and the BBC. Now, it's not quite accurate. What the two organisations are actually the Thomson Reuters Foundation and BBC Media Action, and these are charitable, separate, arm's length, separate in a sense, but they're, in the case of BBC Media Action, absolutely part and parcel of the BBC. Same with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And so we've shown you this before as well, but it's important to make this point very, very clearly. This is Juliet Harkin, who's formerly BBC Media Action. She said, talking about the Syria, we, as in BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. So the BBC, through its arm's length charity, was going into a sovereign state and attempting to create a regime change or a drive for regime change within that country. She went on to say, all media development work that's been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon this idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. So that's BBC Media Action, the Consortium News was talking about. Thomson Reuters Foundation, of course, came to public attention a few years ago because this lady, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, was arrested and imprisoned in Iran for sedition, was what the Iranians claimed. She's still under house arrest in Iran several years later. Monique Villa, who is the chief operating officer of Thomson Reuters Foundation, said that the charges that Iran charged Zaghari-Ratcliffe with are linked to her work at BBC Media Action and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And she said this is complete invention, as the Thomson Reuters Foundation doesn't work in Iran and has no program or dealings with Iran. That may be the case, but BBC Media Action certainly had a program in Iran. So this is Media Landscape's website, and they say BBC Media Action used to work in media and communication in Iran through training and long-term mentoring. At the moment, it's no longer operative in the country, and Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, a dual British and Iranian citizen, is currently in jail in Tehran because of her previous work with the organisation. And unfortunately, at the time that she was arrested and being charged, Boris Johnson, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, admitted that she was teaching people journalism. So the way that it works is this. The Foreign Office funds the likes of Thomson Reuters Foundation, or certainly contributes significant amounts of money to it, and particularly to BBC Media Action. They send their trainers into countries like Syria, Ukraine, wherever it happens to be, Kazakhstan, other countries, and they train journalists, amongst other things. They train journalists in those countries. Those journalists get the full BBC treatment, and then they are used if there's a conflict, as there was in Syria, for example. So BBC Media Action working in Syria since 2004. The conflict begins in 2011. And then from 2011 to the present, the British media uses the journalists that they trained in British media techniques to pretend to be, they pose as being sort of independent, on-the-ground voices in those countries. And then the BBC narrative, or the Foreign Office narrative, is effectively pumped back into Europe, into the UK, into the United States by journalists that were trained by the Foreign Office, by Foreign Office money. So it's quite a good business model for them in a sense. Of course, as my friend and colleague Vanessa Bailey was pointing out in a tweet from 2019 here, Channel 4 News, who was absolutely making use of some of these journalists. And she was saying with Channel 4, pro-Forsama documentary with Wad Al-Khatib, who is Nusra Front, embedded in East Aleppo. And so she was encouraging people to read her article on Mint Press about this, because which was exposing that her husband, Hamza, was Al-Qaeda and an associate and a friend and a fan of Nur al-Din Zinki, who were famous for cutting off the head of the 13-year-old child in Syria. So there are no ethics in this, because the British media and European and United States media absolutely prepared to work with anybody in these war zones in order to get their narrative across. And it is absolutely key to understand that BBC Media Action has been working supporting so-called independent news in Ukraine for quite a number of years. They're pulling the same operation in Ukraine, and we're going to start to see voices from Ukraine appearing in Western media, which were trained by the BBC in this type of narrative building. But the other thing then, if we move on from that then, is to just remind everybody that it was Theresa May back in 2018 who agreed the rapid response mechanism with all the other G7 leaders. And this was about the G7 agreeing that they would decide on a common narrative, and that common narrative would be distributed to through local media. By local media, I mean national media, but local with respect to the G7, and those common narratives, so the agreement at a G7 level about what the narrative was that they wanted to push out, and that would be fed to national populations, so that's really the point that I want to make here is. We have the attack coming in a number of different ways. We've got the attack coming through the mainstream press, through social media, and the control of the mainstream press and social media, but also through foreign media development operations, which are designed to make sure that the voices on the ground in the countries that we are, effectively using in conflict to push through with regime change operations, that those voices are available for the Western media to use in order to build their narrative. But our Foreign Office, your State Department, we're funding this type of training for these types of voices in the first place. And therefore, these are not independent voices that we are getting back from these countries. And that's what I've got for you today, Dennis.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mike. You did what you always do. Let me just first of all ask either Carl or Diane whether they have any questions for you. We have a few questions that we've gotten in, and in addition, I have a few things also to ask. So, Carl?
Yeah, I have three things I would like to raise here. One is sort of a follow-up to what Harley told us about the Nazis in Ukraine, is that the history of the origins of Ukrainian fascism actually date back to the 1920s. The OUN was founded in Poland in 1929 by Ukrainian emigres, including Stepan Bandera, and Mykola Lebed. In 1934, they were actually implicated, tried, and convicted for the assassination of the Polish interior minister, who apparently was opposed to their activities in Poland. These people were, from the beginning, terrorists. They were identified as such by the CIA in the late 1940s. This is in CIA documents. This is not Russian propaganda. And they were, it should be pointed out in Bandera's case that he was actually put in a concentration camp by the Nazis for about 3 years, from 1941 to 44. But the disagreement between him and the Nazis was not ideological. It was political, because the OUN goal was for an independent Ukraine. The Nazis did not want that. But there was never an ideological disagreement between them. The OUN was always fascist. The Nazis knew it was fascist. And so they were otherwise able to work together. And I think that should be, people should be aware of that. The CIA continued to support these groups in Ukraine, these fascist groups in Ukraine, for 40 years after World War II. And I don't think there's any reason to think that that support stopped when the documents stopped. The documents are available up to 1990, but who knows whether or not the support stopped after 1990, after the end of the Soviet Union. Secondly, I wanted to mention that excuse me, the historical origin of Russophobia. I discovered this reading a book on the Great Game, that actually it was invented by the British in the 1820s, a few years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and it was invented as a tool of the Great Game, that in order to facilitate the British carrying out of their policies in Central Asia, that Russia had to be demonized. So that really is nothing new, but we're being subjected to what we've been subjected to in this country for the last several years, particularly with the whole the fake Russiagate scandal, and now Russian quote unquote aggression, and it's been continuous ever since, really, since the 1820s. And the third, I just wanted to ask a question of Mike, because something that's been brought to my attention, but I have not had a chance to follow up on, is something called Brigade 77, which apparently is some kind of disinformation or psychological warfare unit within the British Ministry of Defense, which apparently is involved in all the things that he just described. So if Mike, you can tell us anything about that, I sure would appreciate hearing about it.
Yeah. Well, let me just put this on screen then, if we could. So look, here's a sort of boring diagram of what I'm calling the government censorship network. We've got the National Security Council with the various intelligence services on the left-hand side, and we've got the Cabinet Office on the right-hand side. And we mentioned the Rapid Response Unit, which is there actually gathering intelligence about what people are sharing on social media, and also intervening with social media companies if there's something that the government wants to see removed. They have a back channel to the social media companies to get that done. We've got the National Security Communications Team. We've got 77 Brigade, as you mentioned. We've also got 13 Signals, which is another military propaganda outfit. We've got the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Fake News Unit, which is working in parallel with the Rapid Response Unit. And we've got the Freedom of Information Clearinghouse, which is there to, basically there's a blacklist of people, of activists and journalists who, if they place a freedom of information request with any government agency, that government agency is required to pass that request into the Cabinet Office for a centralized response from the Freedom of Information Clearinghouse, which will generally be a denial of the information. So that is what I'm calling the UK government's censorship network. And 77 Brigade claims that it only works abroad, and that it is there to effectively do the same role as the Rapid Response Unit does domestically. It's gathering intelligence about what disinformation, as they would describe it, is out there, who's pushing it, and so on, and also making sure that it's countered in some way. So it is a British militarized version of what else is going on in the Cabinet Office. But I've mentioned previously on this program that we have, I think, I can't remember exactly, Nick Carter, who was the chief of the defense staff, I think mentioned something in the region of 20,000 reservists for that. I could be wrong about that number, but it was of that kind of scale. So it's not a small operation.
Okay, Diane, anything?
Yeah, I had a few questions, but I was just thinking about the LaRouche organization has just released a new pamphlet regarding global Britain and this Green New Deal, because part of what was said is that enforcing this Great Reset Green New Deal is it's going to become a military doctrine in a certain sense. And I actually wanted to get the thoughts of both of you on the relationship between what was discussed, for example, in Glasgow at the COP26 conference and the kind of things that we see unfolding right now. I think Carl's cat is objecting to the ban on Russian cats.
We can get to raising the question of the Russian cats in a moment, but if we want to, first of all, why don't we go first to you, to Carl, and see if you have an answer for Diane, since you may otherwise end up being preoccupied there.
Right. Well, to be honest, I have not looked at that much in detail lately for reasons which I hope are obvious. But it is the case, and that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has made this clear, that all of these assumptions about the climate change and global warming and all of this stuff is being incorporated into the defense doctrine documents and national defense strategy and all of that. So, I mean, the Army recently released a program on how it's going to basically turn all of its vehicles into electric vehicles to combat climate change. I mean, that's sort of a low-level aspect of it, but there's also higher-level aspects of basically concluding that conflicts around the world will be exacerbated by climate change and things like that. So that's really what I can tell you off the top of my head.
Okay, Mike?
Well, in the UK at least, we have seen a shift in the direction of military strategy. They've released what they're describing as their integrated operating concept. And the first thing they say about it is that the integrated operating concept takes the military from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. But they're also talking about, as we've mentioned before, the perpetual war narrative. So they basically said, look, war and peace, these binary states of war and peace no longer apply. We're in a state of perpetual war, but they're aiming for a state of perpetual war which is below the threshold, just below the threshold of what might actually become a kinetic war on a broad basis. And so they see it as a full spectrum war, information war, cyber war, and so on. And one of the things that I think they are really working very hard to do is to build connections between defense and military institutions and other government departments, and they call this the Fusion Doctrine. So we're seeing the military getting involved in all kinds of what would otherwise be civilian initiatives at a person-to-person level, but even at an infrastructure level now. I mean, Britain is just in the middle of launching a new sort of network of of communication satellites. And Britain recently bought a satellite company which was bankrupt called OneWeb, and OneWeb are attempting to launch satellites in competition with Elon Musk's Starlink network, right? And actually, the Russians just announced a couple of days ago that they were no longer going to take part in those launches because for obvious reasons. But what Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defense, said very clearly not too long ago, a few days ago, was, look, we are looking at making sure that whatever civilian satellite launches there are will be dual purpose, so they'll also be used for military purposes. And this is one of the reasons why the UK government is so keen to make sure that Huawei is removed from the UK's 5G telecoms networks at the moment, because we are seeing this integration between civilian and military infrastructure. There's no divide between these, no separation between these anymore. So at an infrastructure level and at a human level, that seems to be a pretty major shift in the way that certainly Britain is organizing itself. So I don't know if that goes part way to answering what you were asking, Diane.
Yeah, I also had another question for you, which is, there have to be people fighting this. I don't know the detail. I mean, in terms of the control of the media, for example, or the control of the internet, etc. And I know there were huge fights. For example, the fight over Huawei, is that part of this? Also, I think there are discussions among nations in the Belt and Road of various different kinds of transoceanic cables to take communication out of the hands of this Anglo-American elite. And I'm wondering what the progress is on that, and if that is a direct counter to this incredible attempt to control information everywhere.
I don't know that I can answer that at the moment, to be honest. I mean, I think that there's a lot of awareness amongst various activist groups and so on of the implications of the legislation that's coming up and so on. But in terms of direct opposition, I can't say that there's anything hugely tangible at this point in time. Really, at this point in time, we've got to make sure that everybody's aware of what's coming and try to build that opposition.
Right, because just to add on to that, it seems to me, I mean, I don't read all these agreements whenever you get a website, but when I signed up for internet when it first existed long ago in the dinosaur age with AOL, I read the entire agreement, and they said in it, be aware that all of your communications are going to basically go through the Pentagon. I mean, that there's central places where these things go. So it seems to me, even though people are trying to set up alternative sites, like former President Trump is trying to set up various networks, that whoever has control over the internet, it seems to me there would be a way right now to completely sabotage that, whatever other so-called independent networks that you think you're setting up. Or is that not true?
Well, I think what the strategy is here is to drive people off, drive the counter narrative off the sort of mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on, and into the alternative platforms like Gab and MeWe and the other various platforms that there are out there. So they're creating effectively what you might describe as protest pens. But once you've got once you've got people into those onto those platforms, if you want to restrict access to those platforms in some way, that becomes a relatively easy thing to do. So yeah, I think what you're saying is correct. So I've lost the train of thought there, Dennis. And Diane.
See, I have a question. That's fine, because there's actually two questions. It was one directly to you, and then an observation I think we can make. This question is, can you ask Mike about the app Telegram restricting access to RT on their platform? This is surprising since people were championing Telegram as the absolute, quote, free speech app for communities to speak freely without censorship. So that's the question. And then someone adds, there's also the option to operate outside of the domain of the internet. I think they mean outside of social media on the internet. For example, use of email or things like that. And if you would comment on these two.
I think that Telegram has been the platform of choice in recent years for activists, but I don't really know that there was any particular justification for assuming that it was going to take a stand on this. At the end of the day, it is expensive to run these types of networks, and therefore you've got to be some kind of corporate entity, and you've got to be domiciled somewhere. And if you are domiciled somewhere, or you're operating in a country which is going to impose this kind of legislation, you're going to be subject to it. So I think no matter who is running the organizations, they are in a very difficult position, and without widespread public support to oppose the legislation, is good, because the online safety bill that Britain is proposing, and it's the same in the EU as far as I know, is talking about criminal prosecutions against directors of companies that don't fulfill the obligations under the legislation. So we're not talking about what might in the past have been some kind of corporate level sanction, a fine, or corporate manslaughter, where actually an individual isn't necessarily on the hook for that. Individuals are going to be on the hook under this legislation, and the UK government has been absolutely clear to the social media companies that's how it's going to work. So what's needed here is a broad based understanding of that, and opposition to that type of pressure that's being put on social media companies. I mean, some social media companies have got directorships that are ideologically in support of a war, a war with Russia, perhaps, but others aren't, but are still subject to this type of pressure. So we shouldn't be too surprised about that. It's really going to require a large amount of effort from a lot of people to make sure that we are able to present or have a public conversation about things that are going on in the world that is not restricted in any way.
Okay, I've got.
I've forgotten what the other thing was, Dennis.
Well, let me put it this way. What I'd like to do, just for purpose of time, and I'll return because I have my own question for you on that, is there are a couple of questions I want to pose to really all three of you. You can elect to answer or not, because if we can get one or two answers, it's fine. There's a question from Adam. It was originally for Harley, but we can take this up. It was, would it be a good move in this present time of anti-Russian hysteria and propaganda to let the world public know how the Anglo-American oligarchy has consistently supported and financed Nazis, starting with supporting Adolf Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s, supporting veteran Nazis against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and now supporting the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So that was his question. Then there was a second question from Sarah, who just asked, what will happen around this war? Do you see nuclear war being started either by NATO or by Russia? How can we stop this war on our end? What do we do as citizens to stop the war? So I'm going to let's start with, let me start with Carl, if you have any thoughts about this thing, about this exposure of the Anglo-Americans and the Nazis, since you were referencing some things about that before.
Right. Well, you already showed us, Dennis, the book, the Hitler book, which was a pioneering work on how the Nazi project was created, right? And I haven't read it in several years, so I have to reread it myself. But I certainly would recommend that people, if they don't have a copy, get a copy and then read that. Because what I found and what little I've looked at in the CIA documents is that they confirm what we wrote, what we reported in the Hitler book to a great extent. So I think that's what we should do. On the other question about nuclear war, yes, there's a great deal of danger that could happen. I don't think it would be started by the Russians. You can't make any forecasts as to exactly how it would happen. The likely scenario, one likely scenario is that the NATO would get involved in the war. It would end up not going as well the way that they would prefer, and then there's the possibility that NATO, meaning the U.S. really, would resort to nuclear weapons to try to change the course of the war. Now, keep in mind that the U.S. has at least 100 nuclear bombs based in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in Turkey. I think the other place is Belgium. I'd have to double check that. But they're there, and it's not just U.S. Air Force aircraft and crews that are trained to carry these bombs, but also crews of German and Italian fighter jets also. So that's something that the Russians and the Soviets before them were talking about for years. That what NATO needs to do is get rid of these nuclear weapons and stop training flight crews of countries that are not nuclear powers to drop them. So I think that's a very real risk that could happen.
Okay. And Diane, anything on that?
Well, on the first question from Adam about whether it would be helpful to expose who supported Nazis in the past and the Nazi activities now, I think that would be extremely helpful. You'll be probably happy to know that earlier this morning in a discussion with the National Executive Committee, Helga Zepp-LaRouche commissioned a video to document exactly, I'm not so sure so much on the history of the first support of Hitler from various Anglo-American sources, but the actual nature of the Nazi nationalist activity and control of the situation in Ukraine and their relationship to the current Ukrainian government, because many people really are not aware of this, and I think it would be very important to get it out. And as far as the second question about danger of nuclear war, I concur with what Carl has said.
All right, very good. Mike, anything on that question itself?
Well, the only thing I would add to that is, if the UK, as an example, is saying that they are operating on an offensive basis, that it's low level, below the threshold of kinetic war, this is a dangerous position to take, because things that are happening below the level of kinetic war can escalate unintentionally or intentionally. So this is a dangerous approach to take, and that also needs to be opposed.
Okay, very good. I was coming now back to you, Mike, because you were asking about that second question, and there were some other snippets of questions that came in. So I'm going to try to put something together here for you, because you've referenced here the International Fact-Checking Unit Network, which is a Soros-funded, I think, operation. Of course, then there's the Rapid Response Unit, which you've talked about in terms of what Theresa May and others set up in 2018 to monitor the online sharing of information. You've also talked about even the fact that if somebody does a Freedom of Information Act request, they sort of automatically go into a pool, which is then being gathered by government, at least implicitly, and monitored. Of course, then you've talked about shadow banning and delisting, and the fact that, in other words, you may be allowed to have the freedom of speaking, but no one will hear you. Sort of like putting you in a sound chamber. You have freedom of speech, but nobody hears it. But the question that was being asked was really, of course, it's about alternate means of doing things. But let's just ask the question, because you said right now we want people to know that this is happening, and then they can take actions, or should take actions. Obviously, the legislation has not yet been passed fully in Great Britain. You mentioned you don't know what the situation here is in the United States. Certainly, one of the things that's happening, and it's the sort of thing that often happens, is something is done, and then the question is, how do people respond to that or react to it? And if there is no reaction, then something else is done. The shutting down of RT is a good example of that. For example, if you're going to try to say, well, this is damaging, well, why is it damaging to have, since you have the preponderance, obviously, of control over media in your country, why would it be damaging to you for some other medium to be operating when you're ostensibly not at war, for example, with that group? You say you're not at war with Russia. So why is it damaging for you if RT, for example, is broadcasting in the United States, since that's not causing any, it's not Tokyo Rose or something like that. We're not talking about a situation where there's a declared war. You say. So I guess my question, putting all this to you, is, given where we are now and what you think should happen in terms of exposing this, we're doing that. What do you think should happen on the part of viewers like the ones that are on here? And there's many other questions and so on we're getting as we speak. What would you suggest they do? For example, taking today's webcast or taking other things that you yourself have done. How do you think they should approach getting other people not only to become aware, but to actually intervene to see if they can stop some of this?
Well, look, I'm not going to say that the right thing to do is for people to suddenly jump onto alternative platforms, because I actually don't think that is the right thing to do, because the people that you find on alternative platforms are people that are already engaged in some way, or and they've already been thrown off Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is. I think the key, if you're going to use social media, at least the key social media platform for this is Twitter, because unlike Facebook, you'll find all your politicians on Twitter, you'll find the media on Twitter, you'll find NGOs, think tanks, all kinds of people on Twitter. You can engage with them directly. And that's what needs to happen at this point. People need to be challenged directly. Now, of course, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that without being deplatformed. But if it's approached in the right way, it can be done. And I think that since I don't know what it's like in the United States, but it's increasingly difficult to go and meet your MP face to face these days. in the UK. So that's one way to get your point across. But the people that are agreeing in our parliaments, in our legislatures to this type of censorship and so on, that need to be engaged directly at this point is what I think. And the other point I would make is that as much as people may dislike the likes of Facebook and Twitter, this is where the majority of the population is and is spending their time. And the one thing that if we think back to, Diane was talking about the early days of the internet. If we think back to the early days of the internet, it was made up of individual websites and some discussion forums, interested in a particular subject and so on. It was only when the large social media companies established themselves that we started seeing ideas cross-pollinating amongst a whole range of different people, and I think we should let that go. We do let that go at our peril. We've got to make use of that for as long as we possibly can, and so that's my thoughts on that.
Okay, very good. We did have another question here. We're going to try to bring it up. I see I'm in the wrong location. That's why I couldn't find it. Which was, did Putin kick out the central banks from Russia? Could this be the reason they will go to any length to demonize Russia? And this causes me to be prompted to put up the pamphlet again so that people have actually we haven't put it up yet, have we? We can get the graphic of our pamphlet because this is part of the discussion. Stop Global Britain's Green War Drive. During COP26 in November, Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney, former governor of Bank of England, and Bloomberg being the Bloomberg News, as well as now worth $150 billion or something, and former mayor of New York City, and the UN Special Envoy on Climate, which is a kind of a position that also Carney operates. The two of them talked about $130 trillion, supposedly, for what they were calling climate change. Well, there's not $130 trillion anywhere in the world in terms of when you look at the actual gross domestic product. It's not even a quarter of that per year. So what they are talking about involved what Carney had spoken about as financial regime change. What the pamphlet does is to discuss why the process you're now seeing and being told is a war in Ukraine and Russia is not that at all, but it has to do with implementing what was called for in November. Prince Charles, for example, in the course of his remarks, said we needed to be on a war-like footing to implement what they meant by climate change. Now, what they meant by climate change is not even necessarily what Greta Thunberg means. They're not talking about changing just by having some solar panels or windmills or something like that. What they're talking about is depopulation, radical depopulation. And the climate that they're going to change is the one that they're changing right now in the mass inflation, the cutting down of food, for example. We know that there is a massive famine problem throughout the continent of Africa and right now specifically in Afghanistan. Notice that nobody's talking about that. And frankly, no one will be talking about that for the next several weeks because they're all going to be focused over here. That's not going to stop those people from dying. It simply is the case that suddenly the focus has been shifted. Someone, and it was an Italian economist, referenced that he thought that perhaps Vladimir Putin should be given the Nobel Prize in medicine because he seems to have solved the problem of COVID, which is no longer being discussed anywhere in the world, or at least no one being discussed in the media that are discussing, quote, what is happening all over the world. So I just wanted to reference that. And no, he has not closed the central banks. We don't know what actions will be taken, though, by Monday of this week. We know that half of the money that was in those banks was stolen, and the other half is vulnerable. So we can look to see that maybe other actions that are taken. I'd like to right now go to sort of summary remarks, anything that any of you have not had a chance to say, or in the course of the conversation and the discussion, anything that's occurred to you. And so I'm going to go to you first, Carl, and then go to you, Mike, and then to Diane.
Well, actually, I think my summary remarks I already made, so I don't really have anything to add to those.
Okay, very good. Mike?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say I sort of feel the same on that one.
Okay, fine, no problem. Diane?
Well, I would just say the combination of factors that we're discussing, which is the potential threat of thermonuclear war, one, and I would underscore for Americans, it's been a very, very long time since a war was fought on the soil of the United States. So it may be hard to imagine Chicago, New York City, or a major city being turned into rubble. But I think you really have to put yourself there and imagine that, because we have such insanity, a kind of deluded arrogance that seems to be rampant in many of our governing institutions. That said, I just want to go back to the petition of the Schiller Institute to convoke a conference to establish a new strategic architecture, a new relationship among nations, and emphatically underscore the part of LaRouche's four laws, because we have to lay to rest this rotten, bankrupt system. There is a bubble of no one really knows how many quadrillions of dollars of derivatives hanging out there, and it can, like all bubbles, it will have to go. You have people, BlackRock, Bill Gates, others buying up real estate, buying up farmland, trying to get into physical commodities, in a sense, perhaps preparing for the end of this bubble. And we have to really fight to have a policy ready to go, actually better to preempt the chaotic dissolution of the transatlantic financial system with going back to fixed exchange rates, a kind of Glass-Steagall separation of the banks, normal savings and loan banks on one side, through which you can issue large amounts of credit for infrastructure building. And, you know, you won't stop gambling on the markets, but don't put the whole taxpayer population on the hook for your gambling losses. And then the final step, I'm skipping, but this question of a fusion, a science driver, because ultimately I think what this comes down to is what is your definition of man? Are we just some smart animal with an opposable thumb? Or is there a way that through creativity and through discovery, we actually self-transform our own species? And then knowing that, we fight for that. That's why human life is sacred, is more important than anything else, because of our unique relationship to the creative process in the universe. And that transcends national boundaries and other things. And I'm not saying we shouldn't respect sovereignty. Sovereignty of nations is a very, very important factor in this. But we also have to realize that there are certain higher principles that are universal among the human species. And we better get our act together and fight for that, or I don't know if another species is going to come along after we destroy our current situation.
Okay, I know that I said that was going to be final remarks, but there's one thing, Diane, we're going to ask you to respond to. Others may have a response, but probably you'll be sufficient, which is a story that we had about the International Cat Federation says it has banned Russian cats from its international competitions in the latest rebuke to Russia. And this graphic was put up as a way of trying to indicate that the Russian cats were involved in the invasion of Ukraine. The Russian tank cats, it was sort of said to say. People are shocked and horrified that Russian forces had invaded Ukraine and started a war. I wanted to know if you had any comment about this, whether you think about this as disinformation or how we should respond to perhaps Carl's cat has a response to that.
Well,
actually,
go ahead, Carl.
Like I'd like to hear
Carl's the expert.
Yeah, well, we actually have 4 cats, and I'm sure that one of them who lives most of the time outside, a big long-haired gray cat, would definitely object to the banning of Russian cats from cat shows.
Okay, Diane, anything to add?
I just understand that the cats are urging all freedom-loving, conscientious performers, artists, and citizens to begin nightly vigils in front of Carnegie Hall, La Scala, and the Metropolitan Opera Company, everywhere else that's banning Russian culture. And observers have cautioned that a selected targeted ban on Russian-bred felines may lead to a surge in rat lines worldwide.
Ooh, 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 bad. Ominous. All right, well, so Mike Robinson, Carl Osgood, Diane Sayre, I want to thank you all for being with us and thank everybody that stayed and was listening and had questions. And now we're going to go to a summary. Let me also reference that we also, apparently, there was a bulletin that the West was about to ban the elements of the periodic table. Some of you know that it was this Russian scientist, Dmitry Medvedev, that invented the periodic table. And so there's a saying, it claims that we are confident we can discover our own elements and they will be bigger and better, said a White House spokesman. Some have wondered whether or not what's being discussed is to substitute the periodic table of elements for a periodic table of substances, perhaps invented by Hunter Biden. But with that said, let's talk a little bit about another important anniversary today, which is today, 89 years ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt got sworn in as the President of the United States. And it was actually March 4th, but it was a Saturday. And it was on that occasion that he gave the speech that people are aware of or have heard some portion of. He said at that time, "I am certain that my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our nation impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly, nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days." Now, it's true that he happened to be the President of the United States, but it was not untrue that he was not a person with great courage. He had just survived an assassination attempt that had happened only a few weeks earlier, which did kill the mayor of Chicago. Roosevelt was not killed because the bullet was deflected by the arm of a woman in the crowd, and as a consequence, he survived. So when he spoke about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he was coming out of a near-death experience, literally, and was about to assume the presidency of the United States. Perhaps that's what helped to charge or energize his first 100 days in office. And some of you may know that what he did late Saturday night, he called a meeting and began the process that, first of all, imposed a bank holiday that coming Monday, and then kept the banks closed as he began sending regulators into the banks to establish how much of what was on the books of the banks was pure paper, speculation, worthlessness, and what represented the real investments of real income of the real population. And he did this separation, which later on in June of 1933 would be codified as what was called Glass-Steagall. Fundamentally, in today's world economy and today's American economy, there has to be a differentiation between the massive amounts of paper which are unpayable and which constitute what people are calling wealth, but which is really simply hot air, and the real investments in the real economy, meaning the plant and equipment, the mining, the manufacturing, the agricultural side of our economy, the real physical production side of our economy, which has shrunk from its level of approximately 45% of our workforce back in 1955-56 to what is about 13 to 14% of our workforce today. Fundamentally, that's the problem of the American economy. And fundamentally, that's exactly what is the cause for war between the City of London and Wall Street and Russia and China. Those two economies, particularly the economy of China, are based on real physical production and the deployment of a population for the purpose of transforming that population from the standpoint of its skill levels, its education, and its productive capabilities into being not only self-sustaining, but being able to solve the problems as President John F. Kennedy described those in his inaugural of poverty, famine, disease, and even war itself. Now, that's something that the United States was once committed to and was no longer committed to as of August 15th, 1971, when President Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. It could be argued that that itself came from the assassination of JFK November 22nd, 1963, that the United States has never been the same since then, that the issue of leadership that Roosevelt proposes, leadership that leads people against nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance, that is the topic, really, of the present days. As Helga Zepp-LaRouche said in the excerpt that we showed you, the issue for the Greeks of the heroic was compassion, the ability to show compassion and to act on the basis of compassion to evolve and to invent solutions to insoluble problems. That also characterized Franklin Roosevelt, who, when he took the oath of office, was taking that oath of office on the family Bible, Dutch Bible, which was open to 1 Corinthians 13. Though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels and hath not charity, I am become as sounding brass or tinkling cymbal. And though I have, all faith and all knowledge rather, and can have faith so as to remove mountains, if I have not charity, I am nothing. And importantly, though I give all money to the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, if I have not charity, I have nothing. The issue involved in our time, and the issue involved today, as we are speaking, as to why this once great civilization of the transatlantic world would plunge itself through decadence into self-destruction, is whether or not it's possible for people to reach inside of themselves and provide the leadership that is required, regardless of the so-called title or position or degree you think you hold. That's what the true issue of the Republic of the United States is. The United States is not really a democracy. It's not founded as a democracy. That's exactly why the founders didn't do it. They recognize that you can often get democratic mobs, like a Klan mob, which democratically decides that somebody black has to be hanged. Everybody takes a vote and you lose the vote. No, the idea is that you want to have a country which is a republic in which leadership emerges, often self-designated, which decides that, no, the direction of the society is wrong and we've got to make something change. That's, for example, what a person like Martin Luther King did and was very celebrated for. That's what a person like Malcolm X did and was very vilified for. And it really wasn't different. There was a difference, perhaps, in outlook in one sense, but the idea was, and the idea has to be, that in this time, people step up who recognize that lies are being told. We're not going to tolerate the lies. We're not going to be drawn into war as a result and self-destruction as a result of the fact that we didn't have the courage to tell the truth, which is exactly what would destroy the society at this point, and the only thing that could destroy the society. Otherwise, the solution is there. Russia, China, India, all of which are continental-sized nations like the United States, are capable, together with the United States, of rejecting this drive toward war. That's what needs to be done. Not to try to negotiate your way out of this, but you have to reject the axioms of self-destruction in favor of the axioms of self-development. And so the proposal that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has put forward to convoke an international conference based on the idea of the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which happened at a time when Europe had killed 1/3 of the people in that country, the series of countries, in that subcontinent. And people all hated one another, but that's exactly why they had to come together. They had to come together to understand and act upon the interest of the nation that they hated, because only in that way were they going to be able to survive. So whatever may be your feelings about any nation or any group of people anywhere in the world, it's this approach, if you want to put it this way, a kind of coincidence of opposites approach, that we have to take at this time, and that is our only possible way out of the start of World War III. And that is up to us. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank you all for being with us this week, and we'll see you hopefully next week.